Welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas, and who better to join me is two men of ideas, often on the different sides of that ideas debate. But joining me is Ram Guha, historian just out with his new book. I'm also joined by Ashok Malik, columnist and political analyst. Thank you both very much for joining me. Dr. Guha, in your new book, Democrats and Dissenters, we look at the space for dissent, but interestingly, the space for dialogue, which is perhaps a more acceptable word, is one where perhaps the space is shrinking, because no more do we see that culture of dialogue, the belief that perhaps you can convince me of something differently or we can agree to disagree. Yes. Do you agree with that, or is there space for dialogue?
I agree. I think often abuse has replaced argument. And on all sides of the spectrum, social media has intensified and heightened this. It's name calling, it's not reasoned argument, debate, putting forward a facts, points of view. And which is why it's a pleasure to have a debate with Ashok, because there'll be no abuse and name calling in this debate, I'm sure, even though there may be disagreement and dialogue. Absolutely. And I think this is worrisome. Of course, it's a global phenomenon. I mean, if we look at Trump in America, it's a clear illustration of this, but we should worry about it.
What's the impact of it on a culture, or perhaps in governance, or in every area of life, actually?
I think it is, you see, the thing is, most things in a society are nuanced. They are shades of grey. They are not black and white. Sometimes there's black and white. A terror attack on civilians is black and white. It's evil, right? Someone as saintly as Mahatma Gandhi or Ela Bhatt, the social worker, is all good. But most individuals, processes, policies are complex and nuanced, and hence you need to debate the nuances. If it becomes, name calling, that I disagree with you, so you are a Modi Bhakt or a Chamcha of 10 Janpat. That's the kind of language which is not just petty and vicious. It's inimical, or it impedes careful consideration of complex problems. We are a large and complex democracy undergoing profound changes. And at many levels. At some levels we are progressing, at some levels we are regressing. You look at any issue, caste, gender, environment, these are complex and nuanced questions. And I think that's why debate, rational, careful, non-polemical debate is very important.
Ashok Malik, when we bring in that clash, or say the lack of dialogue we see around us nowadays, is it also because when we talk about a transition that India is going through, a transition perhaps after 2014, when a new set of ideology came into government, and the belief that the whole dominant narrative had been actually controlled by a certain set of ideas, or people who were loyal to a certain set of ideas for years. And that's why we need to actually establish our dominance and then talk about ideas like dialogue and dissent. But let's first establish the dominance of our set of ideas.
No, look, every government, every regime does seek to dominate in the realm of ideas as well. I mean, that's beyond debate. I agree with what Ram is suggesting, in that attention spans are becoming shorter across the world. Technology, far from driving dialogue, is driving argument, whether social media or television, or frankly even mainstream media. But the point you are suggesting is a little different from that. That is a broader framework. What we are seeing politically currently, or have seen in the past 2 years, is actually a bit of a battle for the spoils. The word conservative, I read his book, Rapid read his book over the past 2 days. The word conservative is used in this book, and it's used loosely by a lot of people. Now, conservative essentially means people who prefer the old ways and don't want to change. Sometimes I wonder whether some of Mr. Modi's adversaries, some of this government's adversaries in Delhi, who are so stuck in their ways, who are part of an establishment, whose parents were part of an establishment, whose grandparents were part of an establishment, are they the true conservatives? And are the so-called newcomers actually the force for change? So a dialogue there is not really a political disagreement as much as a concern about spoils.
In fact, at this time, and when we talk about Democrats and dissenters, it's a time when we say a threat by Pakistan, especially after the tragic attack in Uri and the events in the UN General Assembly and Nawaz Sharif's speech. It's interesting that India's response has been that in the land of Takshila, and you've written in your book about when you actually visited Takshila, and they said the land of Takshila is now the Ivy League for terrorism. Is this a time when you often find in democracy that issues like you brought up in your book are laid aside, caste, gender, etc.? It comes about a larger idea of India as a nation under threat.
Yes.
What is the impact of something like that when it actually plays out, or when you see what's happening around you? Do we speak in a uniform voice? Do you actually say that at this time perhaps there is no space for dissent? There has to be a uniform goal, and the idea of one nation, one threat and one response actually gets buttressed?
I think the attack on Uri was abominable. If it was not directed by Pakistan, it was aided and abetted by Pakistan. The same was the case with the attack on the parliament in 2001, the attack on Mumbai in 2008. Pakistan is an accomplice, and an important accomplice and an enabler in all these terror attacks. But Pakistan detests India. The Pakistani establishment detests India. The Pakistani army particularly detests India because they haven't forgiven what happened in 1971. But that should not, in tackling the threat from Pakistan, which is a real one, or the threat from terrorism emanating from Pakistan, which affects civilians, has affected civilians, which is a real one and a serious one, while we're united about that, we should not let our attention be diverted from the crisis in Kashmir. Regardless of Pakistan, we have a problem in Kashmir. Pakistan's interest is in stoking and making that problem worse. Arguably, the intention of the terrorists was that if you attack Uri, there will be more repression in Kashmir and hence more sympathy for the Azadi movement. Whatever the malign and malevolent calculations of the terrorists emanating from Pakistan, India has a duty to be fair and just to the people of Kashmir, to honor the promises made at the time of the accession in 1947, not to use excessive force. It's absolutely true that most of the lack of trust in Kashmir between the people of the valley and the government of India is a consequence of failures and mistakes by previous Congress regimes. But the current BJP, so I think we have to bracket this. The threat from Pakistan is real. Pakistan is a malevolent, the Pakistani establishment is malevolent and malign and wants to damage civilians in India. But in Kashmir, the government of India does not have clean hands either. And I think we have to bracket these two.
But I was just going to raise 2 points you made. One, you've said again and again terror attacks against civilians. This, of course, was a terror attack against the army.
Yeah.
But in a sense that even after Pathankot, the linking between what the government and the policy in Kashmir is not really that clear. In fact, it's actually been, which is good in a way, quite separate. What was happening in Kashmir was happening regardless of the terror attacks on first Pathankot or the terror attack in Uri. Do you necessarily see that there is a link between the fallout
maybe not the government, but the broader ecosystem that supports the government. And I think the statement of the BJP...
It was actually Burhan Wani.
But I think the statement of the BJP General Secretary Ram Madhav after the Uri attack was particularly regrettable. For someone who's a party general secretary, not someone on a TV show or on Twitter using a Modi Bhakt handle, someone who's a party general secretary responsible for Kashmir saying for a tooth we will break a whole jaw. I think this is disproportionate, unfortunate, irresponsible. I think the aim of the terrorists to attack the army camp in Uri was in part to force the Indian government to use more coercive methods in Kashmir against Kashmiris, and I think we should resist that. Just as to draw a parallel, the aim of the terrorists who attacked Mumbai in 2008 was to polarize Hindus and Muslims. They wanted to create a communal riot. That did not happen. The people of Mumbai saw through that game and made sure that. Similarly, today,
and the 92-93 as well, after the Babri Masjid demolition, the same attempt at polarization.
But I think that was. But I think so. I think today we have to be careful. Against Pakistan, we have to be clear and unequivocal. It is a haven of terror, right? At the same time, the government of India, the establishment, the rest of India has a lot to answer for when it comes to the lack of trust between the government of India and the people of Kashmir.
Ashok, one, those linkages, do you see them? But also the belief that this is not a government where perhaps things will be as usual. It's a different government from the 10 years before. And this is a government where there will be a different response. Also the fact that, do you now, interestingly, how for once election campaigns and promises are now really binding the Modi government in some sense. You refer to Mr. Ram Madhav's statement, but literally BJP leaders have no choice but to say this, considering what their rhetoric was in 2014.
Two things. One, even in 2008, under a Congress government, under Dr. Manmohan Singh's government, it was fairly clear to the global community that at some point following in the aftermath of a terrorist attack, India would respond. Any government in India, not necessarily the BJP government.
After the Kargil,
any government would respond. Kargil wasn't terrorism as such, but after a terrorist attack of this nature, any government would respond. At some point, the dam would burst because public opinion would be seething. With Mr. Modi coming into power, that sentiment was perhaps heightened because he product differentiated himself from previous prime ministers and governments as someone who was going to take a tougher line. I think that pressure on him is still there. And frankly, he would be expected to do something. Now, of course, what he does, I wouldn't know. And obviously, no one wants a full-fledged war. Nobody's advocating that. But some sort of imposition of cost on those who have hurt India would be part of his mandate. How he chooses to deal with that is his business. When it comes to Kashmir, again, I've read Ram's chapter on Kashmir and Sri Lanka, the Tamil insurgency there. Now, the current security challenge in Kashmir is the most serious since the challenge in the early 1990s. It's not as bad as the early 1990s, but it's the most serious then. But there is one big difference. While Pakistan is coming into the game and trying to sort of stoke the fires and benefit from it, Pakistan hasn't really caused the current problem. I appreciate that. What's caused it is a very unfortunate, I mean, there are missteps by the Indian government and by various Indian governments which go back into history. I'm not denying any of that. There is a problem between Delhi and the Valley, there is a problem between Valley and Jammu, there is governance, there's all of that. But there is also an element of self-radicalization on the lines of many young Muslim youth, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, who who probably watch internet videos, who probably listen to ISIS propaganda or similar propaganda, and have a messianic belief of what their faith and its politics is all about. This is not a majority of Muslims, not at all, I'm not suggesting that, but it has influenced a section of young people in Kashmir, which is quite different from the political challenges which Ram is talking about.
But why the Kashmir paradox? We just reported this week of the thousands who came out to join the police. There's an army recruitment camp as well. Yes. IS officers, more and more toppers from Kashmir, and the Burhanwanis. That paradox is something which...
It's a complex issue because Kashmir is resolving Kashmir is not just about economics, it's also about dignity. Having said that, there is also this ISIS type caliphate element which would need an iron fist rather than a velvet glove.
Do you see any link at all? And perhaps Kashmir has its own special set of circumstances, but almost the youth uprising, it's almost a different kind of revolutions around India as we talk, whether it's the Patidars in Gujarat, whether it's the Maratha agitations now in Maharashtra, across the country. How is it just about youth feeling that the politics as usual is not something that addresses them or their concerns anymore? Prime Minister Modi, of course, coming in with that promise and very high approval ratings according to the latest Pew survey. What would you see as a student or as a historian looking at politics behind this?
For some time. You see, if you look at it's happened in the last 20-25 years. Young men between 18 and 20 are taking to violence, and there are different manifestations of this violence. It's young men between 18 and 20 who join the Naxalites in central India, who join the jihadis, who join the Bajrang Dal and the Gau Rakshak types, who join the MNS and the Maharashtrian and the other kinds of linguistic chauvinists, and who are now fueling the Jat and the Patidar agitation and the Islamic radicals in Kashmir whom Ashok talked about. And I think this is something, it's young men between 18 and 20, different, taking to violence, expressing anger through street protests, through the gun, through othering people of different religions or different classes. And it is worrying. It's partly a consequence of jobless growth, which has gone on for the last 20-25 years. That Indian, unlike say China and Vietnam and even Bangladesh, the Indian economic development process has not privileged job creation for whatever reason. And I think it's also a consequence of the gap between how you live and how others live. See, in the old days, there was inequality. I mean, again, this is something we're talking about. I mean, the gap between, say, rural Karnataka and Bangalore was substantial. But you couldn't see it visibly through television serials, through advertisements, through glorification of upper caste consumerist lifestyles. So there's a lot of anger, resentment, animosity among the young. And most recently, of course, in my hometown, Bangalore, the people who protested over the Supreme Court judgment in the Kaveri case were again young men between 18 and 20. I mean, there's an excess of testosterone, and they want to. There's a lack of fulfillment of what they see as their ambitions and their aims in life, and it manifests itself in violence across the board, across India for the last 20 years. I mean, the Maoists, fortunately, are now on the back foot, and perhaps on the decline. No one can't be for sure. But if you look at
because the leadership is all old. You're seeing a whole new young leadership of some of these forces.
But if you look at the Maoists, who did they draw upon? Young men in the 80s. If you look at the whole Hindutva movement of the late 80s and early 90s, young men. If you look at jihadis, young men. And I think this is something which is connected to lopsided economic growth. It's a complex issue. I think one needs deep sociological understanding of it. But what is the parallel is, regardless of what ideology they profess and who their targets are, the people making trouble, causing violence are young, disaffected men.